So for the last panel of the day, to conclude, we will hear 4 panelists on the theme Facing and Protesting Environmental Change, Perspectives from Social Movements. So we heard in the previous panel more structural critical perspectives on the causes of environmental conflict. So for this panel, we will hear from scholars that are more interested in the actors and the communities living and protesting environmental change and environmental crisis. So first, we will hear from Milan Ilnyckyj from the University of Toronto. So Milan, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Just get my slides up. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about my dissertation on the campus fossil fuel divestment movement in Canada and what it says about the broader fight against climate change. And you can access my dissertation and some related documents with the links there. So in terms of where fossil fuel divestment came from, divestment is a mechanism to try to achieve political goals through non-traditional means. It's a way of targeting private actors as a way of influencing public opinion and public policy. And that's motivated in part by the perception that the conventional mechanisms of political action, domestic politics, international diplomacy, are not adequately addressing the problem of climate change. It's a pressure tactic that has been applied before in relation to causes like South African apartheid, tobacco, and the genocide in Darfur. In 2011, Swarthmore Mountain Justice in Pennsylvania adapted the divestment tactic to apply to mountaintop removal coal mining. And it was at that point that Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, who are involved with the environmental NGO 350.org, saw that effort on coal mining and remembered the anti-South African apartheid campaign, and also the Carbon Tracker Initiative's identification of the so-called carbon bubble, which is the idea that if we are going to keep climate change from becoming catastrophic, the great majority of the world's remaining fossil fuels have to remain underground. And so there's no economic justification for further fossil fuel development. The movement had 3 central objectives, which could sometimes be in tension with each other: to drive institutional action, that is, to get universities to actually divest, to delegitimize the fossil fuel industry in the eyes of decision makers and the general public, and to try and build a climate movement by recruiting and training activists. Some of my personal background coming into this: from 2001 until 5, I was an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia with a focus on environmental politics. And I did some publications on fisheries and persistent organic pollutants. Between 2005 and 7, I then did my MPhil at Oxford in international relations with a focus on the role of science in global environmental policymaking. I worked for 5 years for the federal government, chiefly for Environment Canada, and then I began my PhD at the University of Toronto in 2012. And in 2022, I published my dissertation on how participating in the campus fossil fuel divestment movement affected the political beliefs and behaviors of the student organizers. One of the major justifications for the movement is that it would recruit and train a new generation of activists. So my main research question was to find out how being involved had altered their political opinions and behaviors. And to that end, I conducted 64 semi-structured interviews with activists across Canada. My dissertation is structured using concepts from the contentious politics theoretical framework. The first of which is the political opportunity structure in which the movement emerged and operated. One crucial dimension of that, in terms of the rising salience of climate change, has been climate science and the successive publications of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change since 1990. The crucial point from the IPCC is that unmitigated climate change of well over 3 degrees Celsius would be devastating for humanity and nature. The Carbon Tracker Initiative produced an analysis showing that proven fossil fuel reserves are 5 times greater than what we can safely burn. So further investments in production will be wasted. Another dimension of the political opportunity structure was the status of universities as persuadable targets. Every university in Canada markets itself as green and concerned with the welfare of its students. Climate change was also a relatively palatable cause, particularly in comparison with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign targeting Israeli conduct in the occupied Palestinian territories. Though at the same time, the hope that universities would actually actively condemn the fossil fuel industry for the harm that it's causing and its misinformation was too much to expect or ask for, based on the subsequent experience of these campaigns. Universities were an attractive target because they provided a large group of young people to recruit and a way to target private actors when government action at the national and international levels was failing. We should also consider the important role of 350.org as a divestment proliferator. They transformed Swarthmore's divestment tactic into what they called a campaign in a box, with centrally set objectives and media outreach, but decentralized implementation by volunteers at each of the individual university campaigns. Implicit to this strategy was cultivating a cadre of volunteer campaign organizers, which is what I chiefly looked at. In terms of mobilizing structures, the campaign in a box and its implementation, in addition to objectives and a messaging strategy, the campaign in a box provided guidance on how campus fossil fuel divestment campaigns should organize themselves, specifically encouraging non-hierarchical and informal forms of organization, inspired in part by the Occupy movement and also by a desire to model alternate power structures. Consensus was widely used as a decision-making system, but in practice, that often meant accepting silence as agreement when people simply stopped raising their objections. Elements of Cohen et al.'s garbage can model are evident here. These campaigns functioned as organized anarchies with ill-defined and inconsistent preferences, unclear technology, and that they had informal processes and rules and fluid participation. However, despite that, we observed sophisticated planning as well as efforts to cope with organizer burnout. Based on the literature, these are somewhat surprises. There's an idea that if you don't have a formal campaign and organization, you lack institutional knowledge and can't make these kinds of structured, strategic decisions. And there is a claim in the literature that activist groups pay limited attention to burnout. However, talking with these campaigns, it was an issue that they were acutely aware of and working to counter. One key point here is there are 2 central views of what the climate change problem is, which we'll get into in a moment. And one of those views is based on intersectionality, the so-called climate justice perspective. And the mechanisms of organizing campaigns, which were encouraged by divestment proliferators, most importantly 350.org, arguably favored that interpretation and framing. So what campaigns actually did were the repertoires that they employed. It's important to note that the main driver of tactical choices is norms within the activist community. This case doesn't provide much support for the idea that activists closely link their tactics to what will persuade their targets, or that they time changes in their level of contentiousness to reward or punish actions by their targets. Sociologists have long established the importance of norms, which are subjective heuristic judgments about what feels appropriate in a given circumstance, doing certain things not to achieve an objective per se, but because it's what activists do. 2 central parts of the repertoire are story of self and enemy naming. To make the unemotional and abstract problem of climate change concrete and morally salient, activists use the story of self, where they tell their own biography and explain why in terms of their own lives they're active on the issue and care about the outcome, which helps to make their demands perceived as legitimate. Meanwhile, portraying the fossil fuel industry not as a morally innocent supplier of public demand, but as an enemy of humanity that needs to be called out and named and blamed for activities like misleading the public and decision makers. Proliferator organizations like 350.org urged campaigns to keep the fossil fuel industry as the enemy that's named, rather than their universities themselves, who are the potential hero who can make this decision. But campaigns were sometimes more militant toward their universities than the proliferators likely would have recommended. Tactics ranged across a spectrum of contentiousness, from simply providing information through university-established processes to forms of nonviolent direct action, such as sit-ins and building occupations. Both proliferators and campus fossil fuel divestment campaigns themselves saw the need to marry an inside game focused on pressuring the university administration with an outside game that meant to build public support and apply a greater degree of pressure. In interpreting activist behavior, it's important to understand that they're performing for multiple audiences and sometimes care more about fellow activists than about the university public or even the target of their campaign, which is one way of understanding how harshly some of the campaigns condemned universities for their inaction, which might seem irrational given that they're trying to persuade those institutions to act. So going back to that main point about framing, there are two worldviews which are present in this movement: a climate justice view focused on intersectionality, and what I call a CO2 energy view focused on the narrow problem of climate change and where we get our energy from. So the movement involved profound disagreement on what even the problem being solved was. In the climate justice view, climate change is just a symptom of structural injustices like capitalism, colonialism, and racism. And the only way to counter it is with a radical global program of political and economic reform. People with this viewpoint tend to have an evangelical mindset, thinking that those who don't agree just don't understand yet, and then eventually, once everyone has the right information and arguments, they'll come to accept this perspective.
Milan, I will ask you to briefly conclude. Your time is over.
Okay, I'll be very quick. In the converse climate change energy view, climate change arises because of the usefulness of fossil fuels, and the way to overcome it is to abolish them and replace the global energy system with alternatives. Each of these views has problems. The climate justice perspective struggles to appeal beyond the progressive left, and its intersectional focus prevents urgent and focused action on fossil fuels specifically. And there's little hope of policy durability if these progressive policies are enacted and then a government changes. Whereas the CO2 energy view struggles to motivate people, since the action is for the benefit of absent others in the future, not something immediately useful to movement members themselves. My position is that the argument for climate stability needs to be made as an appeal that goes beyond the minority who accept the progressive intersectional assumptions. And I would draw people's attention to Catherine Hayhoe and her ideas about a system-preserving case for fossil fuel abolition, wherein the things that people value, which are threatened by climate change, become the justification for this unwelcome change.
All right. I think, yeah, people will ask their questions if they want to know more. Then I think we'll hear our next panelist, Cara Cagdas from York University. So you have 10 minutes as well, Cara.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you can hear me, right? Here? Okay. I can say play. Okay, thank you. Today, I will present and offer a politics of interpretation to develop an understanding of the food sovereignty movement as environmental activism by drawing on the findings from my fieldwork, where I was involved in Turkey's new agricultural and consumer cooperatives movement. My presentation will consist of these parts. First, I provide a brief background and my methodology. and the main question. Then I will explain why I use the concept of temporality for environmental activism. Then I will share my ethnographic findings about the activist experience of ecological time and economic time as environmental refusal. Then I will conclude with some questions. I will first start by providing a very brief contextualization. The emergence of food sovereignty in Turkey aligns with the state's neoliberal restructuring of agriculture, which gradually ended the state's protectionist micro-interventions, and çiftçi sense, the farmers' union in Turkish, engagement with La Via Campesina during this time significantly contributed to the discourse on food sovereignty in Turkey. The founding of the Kadıköy Consumer Cooperative in 2014 was another key moment for Turkey's food sovereignty movement. The idea for the cooperative emerged from forums and assemblies during the Gezi protests in 2013, eventually transforming into solidarity groups in various neighborhoods. These groups worked with small farmers and producer cooperatives nationwide to promote food sovereignty in urban areas. My research is based on 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork involving interviews, archival research, and active participation in Istanbul's consumer cooperatives. As a volunteer at the Kadıköy Cooperative, I organized meetings, sold products, and communicated with producers to order products. The Kadıköy Cooperative served as a central hub for a broader network of consumer cooperatives and food collectives. The primary question guiding my fieldwork was, to what extent is it possible to economically and ecologically reinvent Turkey's food system through temporal politics? So why temporal politics? In my fieldwork, I realized that framing the food sovereignty movement solely within the political economy of food systems is inadequate without considering its place within deep ecological time. This broader framing is crucial to understanding their mediation between multiple socio-ecological orders and rhythms. Despite appearing limited in scale and scope within everyday economic time, their activities create an alternative ecological time beyond the Anthropocene. These everyday actions resist the slow violence of the Anthropocene while maintaining economic, political, and ethical sustainability. I view temporality not merely as a fixed order, but as an interaction of multiple economic and ecological rhythms. This perspective reveals the sociological patterns and contested forms within these interactions. Understanding temporality as a site of interaction between multiple rhythms allows us to grasp the peculiar conflicts in economic and ecological relations and the activists' efforts to address these conflicts. Their labor of mediation and creation of an alternative ecological time are vital to their environmental activism. So how do activists experience the ecological time of the Anthropocene in their daily lives? This question guided my project, aiming to understand the Anthropocene not as a catastrophic feature, but as a lived experience. To grasp this, we must examine the promises of purity, stability, and non-contradiction that shape the temporal regime of the anthropocentric food system. These promises are evident in the logic of organic food certification, through which the Anthropocene extends beyond plantation regimes to neoliberal frameworks. Organic certification and similar agricultural systems aim to create stable modular production units, universalizing ecological practices in time and space. This normative system strictly defines what is considered purely ecological. Food sovereignty activists encounter the rigidity of certifications when engaging with consumers. Some tensions arose in interactions with consumers seeking the purest products for their children, for example. Or similarly, although not directly related to certifications but resonates with its logic, the decision to sell vegan meat in plastic packaging sparked debates among consumers about ecological purity. In this environment of rigid ecological standards, these activists developed their ecological promises through situated ethics, a form of resistance to the Anthropocene's promises. The cooperative practices situated ethics in their relations with producers in such a way that producers must complete detailed forms about their production conditions, covering aspects from child labor to the impact on non-humans. These forms guide but do not rigidly dictate product inclusion decisions. Product choices are discussed in a very detailed manner during weekly meetings. The activists embrace contradictions in their socio-ecological practices. They may use plastic to be more ecological or tolerate certain chemicals when prioritizing other criteria. These contradictions reveal their ongoing struggle with the Anthropocene's ecological time, challenging promises of purity, stability, and non-contradiction. So how the promises of new ecological time offered by these activists permeate the economic activities could be further understood by looking at their labor of mediation along with producers and consumers. I define the labor of mediation in this case as a set of mediating practices that turn economic action into a form of ecological refusal. During my fieldwork, this labor of mediation was quite visible in the relations of depth and rearticulation of food quality. The cooperative classifies its product orders into 4 categories: weekly, monthly, annual, and less frequent, or what I would call arithmetic. Less frequent orders create economic tensions as funds are prioritized for weekly orders to maintain fast product and money circulation. Consequently, less money is available for less frequent orders. Additionally, the cooperative's minimal surplus value for each product means that saving for payments takes longer than in profit-driven enterprises. Unlike capitalist enterprises, the cooperative does not prioritize profit or fast turnover, leading to unique economic activities that handle slower product and money circulation and delayed payments differently. This approach blurs the debtor-creditor relationship between activists and producers, fostering more non-hierarchical relationships. As one volunteer noted, while they support producers who struggle to access market mechanisms, payments can be delayed up to 3 months, raising questions about who supports whom. Understanding the activists' volunteer labor helps producers view delayed payments as a reason to strengthen social ties. The anthropology of credit and debt literature also suggests that the debt relations create lasting social bonds due to their temporal nature. This dynamic enhances the cooperative network, fostering mutual support and resilience among activists and producers. Consumer expectations regarding food quality and consistent taste often surface over time. It's common for consumers to complain about taste variations, expressing concerns about product quality, like finding stones in lentils. Volunteers then explain that small farmers lack the equipment to ensure consistent quality. These interactions highlight the volunteers' role in sustaining product quality by mediating between ecological and economic temporalities. Listening to consumers and producers and maintaining a flow of information is crucial here. Through this mediation, volunteers reclaim quality by balancing singularity and standardization within this alternative food system. Their resolution, patience, and waiting for producer responses are integral to quality control. This process extends beyond agricultural zones, distributed across production and consumption. Inconsistent tastes can become a sign of ecological production, giving quality a new meaning for quality signification. Also, the volunteers strive to serve the product in its best form through some research activities, which I would call citizen science, for the materiality of products. For instance, if products were too easily spoiled in the last order, a working group is formed to research possible reasons for spoilage. When necessary, the volunteers also ask for advice from some agricultural engineers with whom they already have connections and seek to build a politics of techno-scientific alliance. They are not only enacting their labor of mediation between the ecological time and the economic time, but between capitalist and non-capitalist relations. During my fieldwork, I heard many times from the activists how exhaustive this labor was for them, despite their enjoyment. So I would like to ask these questions for some speculation. To what extent is it possible to make activists' labor of mediation less exhaustive and more enduring? And what does it mean to think about their labor for the strategies of the food sovereignty movement and everyday environmental action around these strategies? These questions still need to be answered through some experiments and new world-making projects like food sovereignty movement around environmental activism. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. So next we will hear from Valérie Lafond from l'Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Valérie Lafond. I'm an occupational therapist and a PhD candidate in applied ethics at the Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. And today we will try to look at the question, why is the climate crisis unjust? An exploratory literature review. Before we officially start the presentation that's going to follow that plan, I wanted to ask you one question that has been a little bit discussed today, but have you ever thought that the climate crisis could be racist or sexist? That's what we're going to see in the next few minutes. So the climate crisis is the greatest threat to health at the global scale in the 21st century. This is explained by the direct and indirect effect it has on health. We can think of the rising temperature that's leading to periods of drought and food insecurity, or the increase of severe storms and natural disaster that has impact on physical and mental health that can cause displacement of populations. While this is a phenomenon that concerns the entire world population, certain populations are more at risk, are more vulnerable to those natural disasters. And, okay, according to the IPCC, between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people are already highly vulnerable to the climate crisis. But what does it mean to be vulnerable in that context? Well, vulnerability is defined as the characteristics of a person or a group and their situation that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope, resist, and to recover from the impact of natural hazards, which are going to be more and more present with the intensification of the climate crisis. That vulnerability is generated by social, economical, and political processes that influence how hazards affect people in varying ways and with different intensities. So considering that the climate crisis is intensifying and that a large number of people are already highly vulnerable to that phenomenon, an exploratory literature review has been conducted on the subject. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. So the aim was to assess the current state of knowledge on the vulnerability factors related to the climate crisis from an ethical perspective. So it's an exploratory literature review since it has been started in a seminar, but it's going to be a part of my thesis project. So for the preliminary findings, what has been found in the literature is that the people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are the most vulnerable to its consequences. So certain groups are more likely to experience loss, damage, and suffering from natural disasters because of certain characteristics that exacerbate their vulnerability to the climate crisis. And those are the preliminary findings about the characteristics or the vulnerability factors to the climate crisis. As I said, it's an exploratory literature review, so there might be others vulnerability factors, but those are the ones that were more present for now. So for the age, I found that the children and the elderly are more vulnerable to the climate crisis. Children are dependent on adults for their survival, and elderly might experience isolation or a diminution of their capacities, their abilities, so that might affect the way they can, for example, escape quickly if there's a natural disaster that happened. To this end, abilities are also vulnerability factors, so that can be explained by the fact that the physical environment often acts as a barrier to people for being able to leave a place quickly in the event of a natural disaster. So if we think that there's a flood, by example, so people in wheelchair might experience difficulties to leave a place quickly in comparison with others. Also, the fact that people with disabilities are given little or no consideration in the development of climate change adaptation policies contributes to their vulnerability to that phenomenon. Concerning the social class, in fact, the people with a lower income are more vulnerable to the climate crisis because they have access to less resources to cope with the consequences. So by example, if they do not have access to an air conditioning during a heat wave, this increases their vulnerability to that phenomenon. Also, there is a race as a vulnerability factors. I don't know if you will see it well. I have my book with me, but we can take a look lately together at it. But there are two maps. I don't know if they can see it online, but I will try to explain it. Okay, so yeah, we can see it a bit that there are two maps. So the first one, perfect. So the map on top is the map of the countries who have contributed the most to the climate crisis. So the darker countries are the ones who contributed the most by the emission of greenhouse gases. And the second map here is the, okay, I'll try to, okay, is the map to the vulnerability to the climate crisis. So the darker countries are the most vulnerable. So if we take a look at those two maps with a race perspective, you can notice that the countries who contributed the most to the climate crisis are countries where majority of the population is white, and while the countries who are more vulnerable to the climate crisis are countries where the majority of the population is racialized. This can also be seen inside one country. So by example, in Canada, First Nation people are more vulnerable to the climate crisis than others. Finally, gender is also a vulnerability factor. So women are more likely to die in case of a natural disaster. That can be explained because of the physiological characteristics. So if a woman is pregnant, it can be more difficult to leave quickly a place dependently of the number of weeks. Also because of the traditional roles that women occupy, so that globally women take more care of the vulnerable people, so children, elderly, and because they have less access to resources to recover from a disaster. So in point of discussion, those preliminary findings show that vulnerability to climate crisis is intrinsically linked to different systems of oppression, such as ageism, ableism, classism, racism, and sexism. So a system of oppression is a form of discrimination that can be made by individual, but also institution, norms, and policies, whether intentional or unintentional, and that contributes to the devaluation of one group toward another. Also, in the literature, vulnerability factors are not considered from an intersectional perspective, which contributes to invisibilize certain realities. So the intersectional approach holds that a person or a group of people can be oppressed on the basis of multiple characteristics, so by example, gender and race. So that contributes to reinforce social inequalities. And finally, many writings address the injustices arising from the climate crisis, but few approach them with the perspective of the people and population who are experiencing them, which results in epistemic injustices. So those are injustices that are related to knowledge and that can harm a person or a group of people in their capacity to know, so that they are excluded from the production of knowledge, and that can result in other injustices because they cannot explain their experience because the knowledge that are available does not represent what they have lived. So in conclusion, sorry, my English is not the best. But since the climate crisis contributes to the exacerbation of social inequalities, it's important to adopt effective strategies and policies to mitigate its effect. So in fact, if we come back to the question that I first asked you, climate crisis is racist, sexist, because at a systemic level, because the failure to take action to mitigate its effect contributes to the exacerbation of the vulnerability of certain people, thus reinforcing the social existence, the existing social inequalities. Sorry. So to this end, applied ethics is an important field to consider in the climate crisis, since injustices arises from that phenomenon. And to this end, I will pursue in my thesis project a project that's going to consider vulnerability factors from an intersectional approach and support epistemic justice in the context of climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. So last but not least, to conclude this round of presentations, I'll give the floor to Justine Keefer from the University of Victoria.
Thank you. Hello, so yes, my name is Justine Keefer. I'm a student at the University of Victoria in the Department of Environmental Studies, and I'll be presenting today on my paper titled The Taking Up of Lands and the Duty to Consult and Accommodate in Alberta. So I'll begin with a paper overview, highlighting the Ilnyckyj decision, the taking up clause and treaty, and the 3 limitations of the current duty to consult and accommodate approach taken by the Crown in Alberta. And then I'll briefly discuss my current PhD research. So this paper was first put together during my master's and was a component of my practicum written in partnership with Kellio Group, a consultation group based in Alberta that's focused on working with nations to protect their rights. So this research was born out of the, at the time, recent Ilnyckyj decision. So I'll begin with an overview of that. So the Ilnyckyj decision was fundamental for many nations because it brought forward shared concerns that nations across Canada hold. So in Ilnyckyj, which occurred in the BC context, Blueberry River First Nation was successful in making the argument that thousands of individual project approvals, when added together, have resulted in the significant diminishment on the amount of lands on which nation members can meaningfully exercise their treaty rights. So Justice Burke in the case concluded that the extent to which the government of BC has taken up lands for industrial development means there's no longer sufficient and appropriate land for the exercise of treaty rights. Justice Burke further clarified that the right of governments to take up lands afforded through the taking up clause of the numbered treaties is not without limit and must be considered in relation to other promises made in the taken up clause, those being the rights of nations to continue to hunt, trap, and fish and maintain their way of life. So I take this decision and I apply its requirements within the Alberta context. Despite there being no legal precedent, it's an important exercise as many nations in Alberta are taking this same sort of action. So just providing some further clarification on what the taking up clause exactly is. So as written here on the slide, the clause states that they, meaning Indigenous nations, signatory nations, shall have the right to pursue their usual vocations of hunting, trapping, and fishing throughout the tracts surrendered as heretofore described, subject to such regulations as may from time to time be made by the government of the country, acting under the authority of Her Majesty, and saving and accepting such tracts as may be required or taken up from time to time for settlement, mining, lumbering, trading, or other purposes. So analysis of oral history of the signing of treaty shows that nations were not only asking for the protection of their rights, but also requiring the continued health of ecosystems so their rights could continue as they always have. So therefore, the protection of Indigenous nations' rights is inherently an issue of environmental protection and effective management. The other aspect is this clause limits rights geographically. That is, nations can only exercise their rights on lands not taken up by the Crown. So several court decisions have framed out 4 important aspects of the taking up clause. First, the taking up of lands and the use of these lands is subject to the visible and incompatible use test determined in Badger. This means that Crown lands can be used by nations for the exercise of rights as long as there's not a visible use. However, what counts as visible and incompatible uses is constantly shifting, so nations generally avoid exercising rights on Crown lands out of concern of prosecution. Second, the taking up of lands needs to be considered cumulatively. Assessment of impact can't be on a project-by-project level. Third, the Crown must understand their rights to take up lands as a qualification of signatory nations' rights to hunt, trap, and fish. So these rights must be considered in relation to each other without one being seen as inferior to the other. So this is what I was just discussing, was also determined in the Yehi decision. And lastly, the Crown must act honorably in its consultation and consideration of impacts stemming from the taking up of lands, even if it doesn't constitute an infringement. So this duty to act honorably is what's called the duty to consult and accommodate, which stems from Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, that recognizes and affirms the rights of Indigenous people. So through case law, the duty to consult and accommodate requires that Crown bodies, generally through delegation to proponents, must consult with Indigenous nations anytime a development project has the potential to impact their constitutionally protected rights. So based on this understanding of treaty and government responsibilities to understand and assess impacts to nations' rights, I begin to assess the government of Alberta's duty to consult and accommodate processes under their environmental impact assessment approach to determine whether they are meeting these goals. So I argue that the government of Alberta's policy and guidelines on consultation with First Nations fail in three critical ways. So first is in interpretation. The government of Alberta uses a narrow interpretation of what treaty rights are, including only the rights to hunt, trap, and fish for subsistence, not economic gain. This neglects other rights such as food harvesting. The government of Alberta also does not recognize the Aboriginal rights of nations in Alberta, arguing that these rights were extinguished through the signing of treaty. Therefore, these rights are also not assessed for potential impacts, including rights around burial and ceremonial grounds, or any rights that are integral to the preservation of nations' cultures. So this effectively limits the amount of impacts that are assessed and damages nations' cultures. Second is around the identification of impacts. So there's a high burden of proof required to prove an impact to rights, with the government of Alberta using the language of directly and adversely. So the word directly limits the assessment of impacts to a project footprint, neglecting relationships between impacts or the assessment of cumulative impacts, which can be understood as those impacts across both time and space. And then the other aspect, adversely, means that it's not enough for nations to prove that there's an impact within their traditional territories or treaty area, but they also have to prove that they're actively exercising their rights in the impacted area. So as a reminder, treaties grant treaty rights to nations throughout their entire treaty area. So to put this requirement on renders treaty rights to a use it or lose it privilege. So we can think of this in contrast to private landowners' rights, where there's no requirement to prove that a right is actively exercised. It's enough that a right is simply held. So the high burden of proof results in few impacts being identified, and if impacts are identified, they're often deemed to be insignificant. The final failure of the government's approach is around accommodation. So accommodation is used to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts to treaty rights. However, if, as demonstrated before, rights or impacts aren't being identified, no proper accommodations offered, and impacts can't be meaningfully mitigated. So the result of these three failures is that many nations in Alberta find themselves in a similar position to Blueberry River First Nation in BC. So lands are taken up by the government projects without meaningful assessment of the impact to their rights or proportional accommodation. The result of taking up lands and environmental degradation is that nations can no longer exercise their rights in their preferred manner in their traditional territories, which is a direct infringement of treaty. So 2 nations in Alberta have taken up similar cases, Duncan First Nation also in Treaty 8 and Beaver Lake Cree Nation. Therefore, I make the argument that the government of Alberta has to begin paying attention and understand the requirements of the Yehi decision that outlines government responsibilities in treaty. So moving into the present, this research has formulated the basis for my proposed PhD research. So I'm working in partnership with nations in the oil sands in northeastern Alberta to look at the ways in which tailing ponds are managed, to determine whether these regulations, policies, and legislation meet the requirements of state bodies as determined in the Yehi decision. So essentially, I'll be expanding on this research to also look at other processes within environmental impact assessment, risk management approaches, and monitoring approaches. So by identifying these shortcomings, I'll work with nations to develop new governance approaches to more meaningfully manage tailing ponds in their traditional territories. So these new approaches are intended to be formulated in relationship with community and through case study analysis that will look at what other nations in Canada might be doing. So in conclusion, to wrap it all up, I'm essentially arguing that the current duty to consult and accommodate approach in Alberta is falling short, and as a result, development projects are causing detrimental impacts to nations' rights in the forms of lands being taken up and land degradation. So a new management approach is needed that meaningfully assesses impacts to nations' rights and moves away from project-specific assessment. Environmental management is therefore a necessary component of the protection of Indigenous nations' rights, and therefore should be also understood as a treaty responsibility held by the Crown. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll take questions from the audience. We have a bit of time, I think, about maybe 10 minutes. Yes.
I see our first question right here.
Hi, a question for Justine. Justine, I'm curious about the fractured forest, the seismic cut lines aspect, which some Indigenous nations in Alberta are very concerned about, but does YEHI cover that? And is that, I mean, that's another aspect of the impact of oil and gas activity, but I'm just wondering, does it speak to it? Does the YEHI decision speak to the influence of cut lines? Because my understanding is that that's such an ambiguous activity and impact that there's not a lot said on it.
So I can't speak directly. I don't know the exact aspects, but I know in their mapping of impacts, they covered like a huge wealth of different development impacts. So anything stemming from oil and gas. And then they also included buffers. So understanding that the impact is not contained within a project footprint, but nation members are also impacted in this buffer area because they choose to stay away from those zones because of development impact. So I can't speak directly to the cut lines, but I'm sure that they were included within those measurements.
Do we have any other questions? A follow-up.
Yeah, this is your paper is very interesting to me, Justine. So I have another question for you. I know in Saskatchewan, because of the Saskatchewan First Act or whatever it's called, there's talk among Indigenous nations of taking up or re-examining the Resource Transfer Act of 1930, and I'm just wondering if that in any way is a factor in the government of Alberta's approach to these taking up lands issues.
Yeah, the NRTA throws some more complications into understanding ownership of resource extraction and sort of those sort of finer points. I haven't delved too deep into it yet, so I can't give you a very good answer of how it will impact things. But for sure, just understanding BC compared to even Alberta or Saskatchewan, the government has different understandings of their ownership of these sort of things and their rights to take up lands because of that.
Thank you.
Do we have another question? Well, I have one maybe to Valérie. I think it was interesting to hear you sum up really clearly all the different types of vulnerabilities. I'm just wondering, how does that translate into policymaking? And maybe it's not surprising that these specific groups of people are particularly vulnerable. I think we all know that, but can we maybe take inspiration from existing policy in other fields that maybe consider how to maybe better serve marginalized populations, and then adapt it to climate policies? Is that something that you're looking to, or like, have you considered the policy aspect?
I haven't looked at other policies in other field of research, but I think that something that might be important in that context is to give space and give a place where people experiencing the injustices and the vulnerability in the context of the climate crisis, so that they can speak toward the dirigents, the governments, so that the policies can take their reality and that policies do not perpetuate those injustices. So I think that might be a hint of an answer, but I haven't looked at other field of studies for what policies and everything, but I know that there are research actually made by its professor Sébastien Jourdouin, I think, and he is interested in the adaptation to the climate crisis, and he meets with people with disabilities, so to get their input, and he looks at different field of studies, and he noticed that in United States, I think it's in Boston, but some of policies have changed because air conditioning is now considered as a medical equipment, so that people that are taking some medication and that makes them more vulnerable to the climate crisis now have access to air conditioning at home by the government, because it's kind of a way to adapt to the climate crisis. So I know that there are researchers in that field, but I haven't looked deeply.
Any other questions? I think in the back, and then maybe again.
Thank you. My question is for Milan. I was wondering, so you spoke a bit about these two kind of contrasting worldviews or motivations of these groups of activists. You know, one having this very radical approach to dismantling capitalism and systems broadly, and the other sort of being focused primarily on shifting energy sources. And so I wonder, and maybe you did speak to this a little bit, perhaps I missed it, but what do you see as being the solution? Because you did mention that, you know, neither of these, or both of these encounter issues, I guess. So what do you think is the solution to this problem? Is it a reconciling of these two different perspectives, or is it something else entirely?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I don't think anyone has an answer, but I think the closest thing to an answer has to be look at some of the research like Yale's project on 6 Americas, where they break down the population in terms of how concerned they are about climate change. And some of the work of people like Catherine Hayhoe, where she calls attention to how there's a very small minority within the population that likes the idea of radically changing and replacing everything, but that group is both small and consistently unaware of how small it is. There are a lot more people who favor the status quo and would work to perpetuate it. So essentially her proposal is a system maintaining argument for fossil fuel abolition, that if you want to keep sea levels where they are and river patterns and biomes all where they are, you should take action in order to preserve what you value, rather than create this utopian new world, which may have the capacity to appeal to a broader segment of the population and may have a better chance of producing policies that stay in place between changes of government. It's not much use to put in a progressive Green New Deal for a couple of years if it then gets reversed by the next center-right government. Indeed, to be effective, climate change policies need to stay in place for decades. So we have to find some way of developing a political consensus to keep them operating.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Only if there's no one else, because I can keep asking questions for a long time. This is a question for Milan as well, and it was sort of prompted by your passing reference to tobacco campaign earlier on in your talk. I'm wondering, partly if you've looked at it and compared at all the tobacco campaign with the campus climate or fossil fuel divestment, but mainly it made me think about whether the burnout that you were referencing has any relation to outcomes, because it seems to me that the tobacco campaign has certainly had a different outcome to the fossil fuel divestment campaign to date. That's kind of vague. Take it where you want.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll talk about tobacco first and then burnout second. Tobacco is definitely a useful precedent, not only because it is a harmful commercial area in which universities and other public bodies did withdraw their investments, but because of how the misleading actions of the industry have been considered as a major legal and political knock against it. There was a great hope within the people starting the divestment movement that it would be a method to help delegitimize the fossil fuel industry to the public. Though I'd say it hasn't particularly succeeded in that regard. A couple of the reasons are universities are incredibly hesitant to alienate potential donors. And actually, when it comes to public opinion on the fossil fuel industry, it pretty much couldn't be more negative already. People don't want to abolish it, but they already think it's terrible. So there may be limited opportunities there. In terms of burnout, I have no idea about the tobacco sort of campaign specifically, but there's literature from earlier in climate change activism that one of the big problems is when you rely on these informal structures and volunteers, tasks tend to concentrate in the people who are most motivated and determined until the point where they can't handle it anymore and they have to withdraw. So one of the real areas of effort and potentially innovation in mobilizing structures that's interesting within the campus fossil fuel divestment movement is the ways they tried to share out work and prevent that kind of burnout. And awareness of it reflects that some of those criticisms from academics and others are now being addressed in activist practice.
All right, if there are no further questions, I think it's the end of our panel. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you especially to all of our presenters. So tomorrow we'll start the day at 9:30 with morning coffee, and then the second roundtable with practitioner and scholars at 10. So please join us tomorrow. So also I think we were asked if we could have a picture of all panelists. Should we do that? Yeah. So if you don't mind, we'll take a picture with everyone that presented today or will present tomorrow. And last thing, if you cannot join us tomorrow, please give back your lanyards. You can put them on the table in the back. We hope you will join us tomorrow. So yes, thank you everyone.
While our panelists gather to take a photo, I will just thank everyone, both in the space and online, for coming into ForSpace today and activating these lovely conversations. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. Nous allons maintenant fermer la réunion Zoom et la diffusion en direct, mais sachez que la conversation est déjà accessible sur notre chaîne YouTube. Je vous souhaite une bonne journée.